Marcus Turner wasn't exactly the kind of guy you'd send to unravel an intergalactic mystery. Sure, he was an anthropologist, but let's face it, Mark didn't even understand the nuances of human behavior, let alone how aliens thought. If aliens had feelings, he figured, they probably wouldn't have picked him to study their legacy. He wasn't quite sure what legacy meant in the context of extraterrestrials. At first, when he'd been briefed by his supervisor, Vivian Locke, a woman who probably spent her weekends writing long, dry reports about alien culture, Mark assumed the aliens were leaving behind some kind of space art or holographic messages to guide humanity toward enlightenment. Maybe they'd left some wise advice about the future or a giant crystal that could fix all the world's problems. A cosmic treasure chest of knowledge, but no. The aliens had left something much stranger. A legacy of human-plant hybrid farms, a little bit of bio-engineered glitter, and, most troubling of all, a genetic program called the Stud Flow. Yes, that's right. Stud Flow. Now, if you're thinking the name sounds suspiciously like something a bad 80s sci-fi film might coin to describe an alien orgy, you're not entirely wrong. And if you're thinking Mark felt misled, you're on point there too. But somehow, despite the name, because of the name, Mark was getting paid for this gig. Lots of money. Money that would help him pay off his student loans, take a few weeks off to travel, maybe to the Bermuda Triangle, where aliens might be real, but no one's sure, and most importantly, get a little respect at the office. He stared at the holographic file in front of him. A picture of an alien with 6 arms, each one holding a different kind of fruit: papaya, banana, pear, melon. He frowned. Was that what they meant by a flow? Some sort of cosmic salad bar? A message popped up from Dr. Locke's account. Mark, just so you know, I've already briefed the team at the Arizona site. We expect results soon. No one has cracked the stud flow mystery yet. You'll be the first to understand the true nature of the alien legacy. Mark rubbed his eyes, squinting at the file. There was a lot of confusing terminology: xenospecies genetic interaction, hybridization cycles, cultural imprinting through physical engagement. Physical engagement? Was this really a job for him? The thing was, Mark hadn't even signed up for alien research. He had barely signed up for human anthropology. But here he was, stuck with an assignment that made no sense and sounded like an ill-conceived attempt at alien matchmaking. As he thought about the stud flow, he imagined all kinds of strange alien practices. Maybe the aliens were just spreading their DNA around Earth like cosmic tinder? Maybe they had some ancient tradition where humans were expected to, engage with extraterrestrial beings for some deeply spiritual reason? The possibilities were endless and entirely ridiculous. The next day, Mark found himself flying to Arizona. Arriving in Arizona wasn't much better than what Mark had envisioned. The desert heat was oppressive. Cactus plants stuck out of the sand like the last survivors of a forgotten battle. The research facility was a sprawling complex, an ugly, gray structure nestled under a massive dome. It looked less like a high-tech alien think tank and more like an industrial kitchen where they served overly salted mystery meat. Mark was escorted inside by a woman in a crisp white suit who introduced herself as Dr. Julie Griffin, one of the lead researchers. Mark immediately noted the way she glanced at him, sizing him up, like she was trying to decide if he could handle the truth, or if he was just another out-of-his-depth academic who'd gotten too excited about a paycheck. This is the site where we've been studying the genetic legacy left by the aliens, Dr. Griffin said, ushering him into a sterile-looking corridor. She spoke in a tone that implied she was explaining something very important, though it wasn't clear what that was. We have hundreds of subjects here, human volunteers who've participated in the stud flow. Mark blinked. He wasn't sure if he heard her correctly. Did you say stud flow? She responded, as if this were an everyday conversation. We're still trying to understand how the aliens initiated the program, but we've identified a few key principles. One of them involves human reproduction and alien interaction. Mark swallowed, trying to hide his discomfort. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know more, but he knew there was no turning back. The paycheck was too good. The first volunteer he met was a man named Jim, who looked like someone who had just come off a 6-day bender. His hair was unkempt, and his eyes had that faraway look people get when they've seen a little too much. "So, Jim," Mark asked, trying to ease into the conversation, "how exactly did you get involved in the stud flow?" Jim scratched his chin. "Well, the alien came to my house in the middle of the night. You know, the usual stuff. Took me up to their ship, showed me the stars. Pretty cool, actually. Then they offered me, a deal." Mark raised an eyebrow. "A deal?" "Yeah, like a kind of cosmic vacation. Said they needed a special specimen to, help them with their studies. Kinda felt like I was the human version of a pedigree dog. They didn't give me much choice, honestly." Mark nodded, though he was starting to feel a bit squeamish. "And you volunteered?" "Well, not really," Jim said with a shrug. "It's more like they offered me a one-way ticket to, well, who knows where. But they gave me a gift too, a little alien DNA. Figured it was the least they could do, right?" Mark's stomach churned. He had a lot of questions, but at that moment, none of them seemed to make sense. Was this just one man's weird story, or was there something deeper happening? Over the next few days, Mark interviewed more people, mostly volunteers, though a few seemed like they'd been convinced by someone or something that participating in the stud flow was their destiny. One woman, Lila, spoke with a fervor that made Mark uncomfortable. "They're not just giving us their DNA, she said, pacing around the small observation room where Mark was sitting. "They're giving us something more, something that will change humanity forever. This legacy isn't just about genetics. It's about evolution, about changing the very way we think, love, and dream. Think about it, the aliens want us to be like them, perfected." Mark didn't know whether to be fascinated or terrified. His head was spinning from the absurdity of it all. "Okay," he said, trying to stay focused, "but what happens after you engage? What does it mean for you personally?" Lila smiled, her eyes distant. "It's like an awakening. I've never felt more alive. The connections I've had since then, they're not like anything I've experienced before. It's like they're with me, even when they're not here. The stud flow isn't just a gift. It's a calling." At this point, Mark had a full-blown headache. Was this some weird alien breeding experiment? Or was it just a scam to get people to volunteer for intergalactic matchmaking? Either way, he needed answers. But the more he investigated, the more complex the story became. Was humanity on the verge of a new kind of evolution? Or were they simply part of a cosmic game of alien genetic poker, and more importantly, could he even trust the stud flow? Because whatever this was, Mark wasn't sure he wanted to get caught up in it. Mark was standing in the sterile observation room, staring at Lila as she paced in a slow, almost hypnotic manner. Her words had a weight to them, but it was hard to separate truth from mania. Everything in this place felt off. The whole stud flow operation seemed more like a bizarre, half-baked experiment than a grand evolutionary plan. Lila paused and caught Mark's eye. She smiled at him, but it wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from someone who just explained how their life had been transformed by alien DNA. It was the smile of someone who knew something you didn't and was just waiting for you to catch up. "You're not getting it, are you?" she said softly, like a teacher addressing a slow student. "The aliens didn't just want to give us their genes. They wanted us to evolve. It's a kind of communion. A bridge between species." Mark blinked, suddenly aware of how strange the whole conversation had become. Evolution? Communion? He wasn't sure if he was talking to a human who'd had one too many alien encounters or someone who was genuinely starting to buy into this insanity. "I get it," he said carefully, feeling the need to reassure her without fully committing to the idea. "You're saying you've evolved?" Lila's eyes glinted. "Not just me. We all have. Humans involved in the stud flow are experiencing something they never could have on their own. We're connected to something bigger now. Something more divine." Mark had heard plenty of cultish rhetoric in his life. He'd spent years in academia, after all, but this was different. This wasn't the usual jargon about enlightenment or some transcendental vision. There was something intensely personal about it, like Lila had truly come to believe that the aliens were guiding humanity's future in a very direct, physical way. But still, the more she spoke, the more Mark felt like he was missing something. Or rather, something was missing from her, a sense of grounded reality. He shifted uneasily. "And, do you feel different, physically?" He hated the question the moment it left his mouth, but there was no turning back now. Lila tilted her head as though considering the question for the first time. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Mark watched her carefully. He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but there was a weird sense of finality in her voice. He wasn't about to let her get away with some cryptic answer. "Try me," he said, pushing. Lila took a step closer, her tone lowering. "Sometimes, I feel them, the aliens. Inside me. Their thoughts, their presence. They're with me. When I close my eyes, I see flashes of their world. The light. The stars. The way they communicate without speaking. She trailed off, as if lost in the memory. "It's a connection that can't be explained, not by any human words." Mark's mouth went dry. That sounded like something straight out of a science fiction novel, or maybe a horror story. Either way, it wasn't something he was ready to wrap his head around. He didn't know what was worse, the idea that aliens could be invading people's minds or the fact that the government was letting it happen without telling the public. Maybe it was time for him to pack up and go back to researching something more predictable, like ancient tribal dances or historical breakfast habits. But he was too far in now. Too many questions had been raised, and no answers had been given. He needed to know how deep this rabbit hole really went. "I think I need to see it for myself," he muttered, more to himself than to Lila. Her eyes sparkled, but there was something unsettling about the way she looked at him. "See it? You want to see the legacy? It's not just something you look at. It's something you experience. You won't understand it until you're part of it." Mark narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean, part of it? Are you saying I have to join the stud flow to understand?" Lila smiled, but there was no humor in it. "The aliens don't just give their legacy to anyone, Mark. You can't just study it from the sidelines. You have to become it." A chill ran down his spine. "Become it?" Mark wasn't sure what she meant, but the implications were more terrifying than anything he'd imagined. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. Was this a recruitment speech? Was she trying to convince him to join the experiment, just like the others? "I'm just here to observe," he said, his voice sounding more unsure than he liked. "I'm not part of this." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that?" Her tone was too smooth, too knowing. "Because once you've seen it, felt it, you might change your mind. The stud flow doesn't let you stay neutral." Mark wanted to laugh. What a ridiculous idea. Alien DNA, mind melds, evolved humans, it all sounded like something out of a bad science fiction flick. But it was real, and it was happening right under his nose. And no matter how much he wished it weren't, he couldn't deny that curiosity was eating away at him, pulling him toward the next step. The next morning, he was led into a lab deep within the facility, one marked with security clearance levels he hadn't seen before. A tall, thin scientist named Dr. Grant Parker greeted him with a smile that seemed a little too forced. "Glad to have you with us, Mark," Dr. Parker said, shaking his hand. "I'm sure you'll appreciate the uniqueness of this operation." Mark nodded, trying to maintain his composure. He didn't know what kind of appreciation was expected of him, but he was about to find out. "We're going to show you the legacy process," Dr. Parker continued, leading Mark down a narrow hallway that was filled with the kind of quiet urgency Mark had seen in high-security labs before, though this time, the air felt thicker, charged with some unspoken tension. "I hope you're ready for it." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. Ready for what, exactly? Dr. Parker didn't answer directly. Instead, he ushered Mark into a small observation room where a large, cylindrical chamber stood in the center. Inside, a woman was lying back in what appeared to be some sort of medical pod, connected to wires and other alien-looking devices. She looked peaceful, almost serene, but Mark couldn't help noticing how pale her skin had become, almost unnaturally so. "This is the next step," Dr. Parker explained. "The legacy begins here, with direct interaction. It's a physical process that's also deeply mental, spiritual. We've been studying the long-term effects of the stud flow on participants, and we're starting to get a clearer picture of what the aliens were trying to achieve." Mark watched the woman inside the pod, his mind racing. She looked like she was in a deep, restful sleep, but something about the whole scene felt wrong. "Is she all right?" Dr. Parker smiled reassuringly. "Oh, she's fine. In fact, she's one of our most promising subjects. She's nearing the final phase of integration. The legacy will take full effect soon." Mark's stomach lurched. The idea that this process was being called integration seemed deeply unsettling. It was as if these people were merging with something they couldn't control, something far beyond their understanding. "I need to know more," Mark said, his voice cracking slightly. "What happens to her once this process is complete?" Dr. Parker hesitated, a momentary flicker of unease crossing his face. Then, as if brushing off an old concern, he straightened and said, "Well, once she reaches the full potential of the legacy, she'll begin to change, physically and mentally. She'll become more." Mark didn't ask more questions. He didn't need to. The look in Dr. Parker's eyes told him everything he needed to know. These people weren't just studying alien DNA, they were building something new, something that might be beyond their control, and if Mark stayed any longer, he might just become part of it too. The end.